Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here and joining us for our monthly webinar. And I'm really excited for today's discussion on protecting workers, wage theft enforcement for prosecutors. My name is Rachel Marshall. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. The IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. We're delighted to be hosting today's event, and I want to thank everyone for joining. You wouldn't know it from the news, but wage theft is actually one of the most frequently committed crimes in the United States. Yet it is one of the least likely crimes to be prosecuted. Combating wage theft has largely fallen in the past to private civil enforcement, which has largely been an ineffective deterrent. And that's why some local prosecutors, including the two who we have with us today, have developed innovative strategies to protect workers. Today's webinar will discuss why wage theft prosecutions are a critical part of promoting public safety, and we'll explore the practical steps that prosecutors can take to effectively prosecute wage theft and rectify the harms caused by those who exploit vulnerable workers. The IIP has previously put out a guide on prosecuting wage theft, and we'll drop a link to that in the chat during our discussion. In the interest of time, I want to introduce our panelists very briefly. We're going to provide a link for their entire bios, which are very lengthy and impressive. But let me first briefly introduce each of our panelists today. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is the 37th District Attorney of Manhattan and the first Black Manhattan DA in the office's history. During his tenure, DA Bragg created the office's first ever worker protection unit to investigate and prosecute wage theft and other forms of worker harassment and exploitation across Manhattan's many industries. DA Bragg also established the first ever stolen wage fund for Manhattan victims of wage theft, funded through the DA's Criminal Justice Investment Initiative and operated in partnership with the New York State Department of Labor. Next, I'm honored to introduce Travis County, Texas District Attorney Jose Garza, who was elected in 2020. DA Garza was a former federal public defender, immigrant rights activist, and executive director of the Workers' Defense Project, where during his tenure, the organization achieved significant criminal justice reform in Travis County, including winning paid sick leave policies in numerous cities across Texas. DA Garza has a unique understanding of how our broken criminal justice system works and how it impacts our communities, and has extensive experience building power with communities of color, working families, and immigrant communities across Texas. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Terry Gerstein, who's the director of the newly created NYU Wagner Labor Initiative at the NYU Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Previously, she directed the project on state and local enforcement at the Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy, and was a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. Terry's a longtime public service in New York State government, and she worked for over 17 years enforcing labor laws, including as the Labor Bureau Chief for the New York Attorney General's Office and a Deputy Commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor. Scott Stillman is the founder of the Law Office of Scott Stillman, a litigation firm that specializes in advocating for employees and ensuring they receive the fair treatment they deserve. Prior to establishing his own firm in 2023, Scott was an assistant district attorney and labor liaison at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. At the SFDA's office, he started and led the Workers' Rights Unit, which investigated and prosecuted legal violations committed by employers against workers. And finally, we are honored to have Charlie Oshima, who's a project coordinator at the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, where he coordinates the Manhattan Justice for Workers Collaborative, a citywide workers' rights initiative. In 2019, he helped organize and launch New York City's first Workers' Bill of Rights in 5 Latin American indigenous languages. Since 2012, Charlie has worked extensively with grassroots organizations in New York City, like Democracy Now!, New Immigrant Community Empowerment, and Brand Workers. Welcome to all our panelists. We are honored to have you here. We have a lot to cover today. So I will dive into our discussions, but as always, to everyone watching, we are going to reserve some time for questions at the end of our conversation, and we'll get through as many as possible at the end of today's program. So Terry, I'm going to start off with you. As we dive into this discussion, I think it makes sense to first explain what is wage theft? What are we talking about here? And if you could also walk us through a little bit of a history of how wage theft has traditionally been enforced, especially if you could talk about the differences between criminal and civil enforcements and prosecutions of wage thefts.
Great. So that's a lot to get us started. I mean, I think I'll start out just talking about the term wage theft, which in some states there are statutes that explicitly use this term wage theft. And in elsewhere, it's just sort of grown to be used sort of colloquially and in the media to refer to all situations where employers don't pay workers all of the wages that they are owed. So it might be employers just completely stiffing workers and not paying them at all for work that they performed. It might be a situation where employers don't pay overtime and they pay, the regular first 40 hours by check, and then pay overtime hours at straight time, not overtime rates, off the books. It could be when people are doing uncompensated work time and they're working before they clock in, or they're told to work after they clock out. It could be employers requiring kickbacks from wages, stealing workers' tips, making unlawful deductions. Like there have been some cases where employers deduct money from workers' wages for benefits like health insurance or retirement, and then the employers just keep the money and don't remit it to where it should go. So it's a wide range of different kinds of practices in which employers do not pay workers all of the money that they have earned and that they are owed. In terms of the history of sort of how it's traditionally been enforced, historically it has generally been managed as a civil matter. And I think that's something that many of us on this panel probably, hope to see change. I always say that if a worker embezzles from the employer, there's not much question about whether that is something that's an appropriate subject for criminal prosecution. But if the employer steals money from workers and does not pay them wages, there's no reason that as a matter of equity, that should be treated in a similar manner. But within civil enforcement, there have been private attorneys, like plaintiffs' wage and hour attorneys, who have historically brought these cases. It's much harder for them to do that these days because a growing number of employers are using forced arbitration and forcing workers to give up their right to bring a class action and give up their right to bring a case in court. It makes it really hard for workers to find lawyers who will bring those cases, leaving government as the only option. And we have civil enforcement agencies like the Federal Labor Department, which has the Wage and Hour Division, state labor departments that also do enforcement involving wage theft. There are incredibly dedicated, smart, committed people in a lot of these state and federal and now also local civil labor agencies, but they are really starved for resources and do not have what is needed really to get the job done appropriately. And I'll just give one example of that, which is that the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, which enforces not only the minimum wage and overtime laws, but also Paid Family and Medical Leave Act, the child labor laws, a whole host of other laws. Nationally, they had at the end of 2023 only 733 investigators for the entire country. And that was almost 500 fewer than they had in the late 1970s, even as the economy and number of workplaces has massively grown. And so we really have our civil enforcers are just sort of, there's just not enough resources. And often when they resolve cases, the resolution involves employers paying back what they should have paid in the first place, which really doesn't always operate as a deterrent. So I think I'll stop there because I know we have so many things to talk about, but that's a good framing for us to get started.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Terry. And Dia Garza, let me bring you in because as we've been talking about, wage theft is an emerging area of focus for many prosecutors. And you have, as we mentioned in your bio, have a long history of advocating for workers' rights. Why do you see wage theft as something that should be a criminal matter?
First of all, it's just really great to join you and great to be part of this incredible panel with so many friends and colleagues. For us, this is a pretty simple calculation. Wage theft is about public safety, and enforcing criminal wage theft laws is about our public safety. And we all collectively know what public safety is. What public safety is access to good jobs. It's good schools to send our kids. It's access to healthcare and mental health care. What public safety is stability. When families are stable, they are safe. Those communities are safe. What wage theft does, what happens when an employer steals money from their worker, is it destabilizes that family, it destabilizes that community, and that makes all of us less safe.
Thank you. And one pushback that I've sometimes heard, and I wanted to get your take on, is concerns about net widening and broadening the reach of the criminal legal system. And so how do you see the prosecution of wage theft cases in line with talk of decarceration, for example?
Yeah, I want to tackle that from two perspectives. First, from specifically from the perspective of decarceration. Let me just say, at the Travis County District Attorney's Office, we are consistent in our philosophy about criminal cases. We view incarceration as a result that we should get to only when that is what is in the interest of our public safety. And so one of the things that we've done is dramatically expand our pretrial diversion programs in the district attorney's office. And what that means is that the overwhelming majority of people accused of nonviolent offenses have the opportunity to have access to job training and job placement, have the opportunity to have access to help and support to address substance use disorder, have the opportunity to have access to mental health services. We believe that what's in the long-term interest of our public safety is addressing the root causes of crime in our community. And so if people can get access to those services and those opportunities, in the overwhelming majority of instances, we will dismiss their criminal case. We take the same approach when it comes to wage theft. Our goal, first and foremost, is to prevent the risk of instability. And the way we do that is by securing restitution, by securing back wages, by making that worker whole. And in the majority of instances, if an employer can make a worker whole, we will dismiss that case, just as we would any case that enters into our pretrial diversion program. But let me tackle that question from a different perspective. Decarceration is absolutely a goal, I would say, of criminal justice reform. We know that as a country, we're responsible for 20% of the world's incarcerated population, but only 5% of the world's population. And we know that using incarceration as a singular strategy for public safety has failed miserably. We also have one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world. So decarceration is absolutely a goal. But a broader goal I would propose of the reform movement is to ensure that our criminal justice system treats everyone equally and fairly, to ensure that our laws, our criminal laws, apply to everyone regardless of how much money they have, what their title is, what uniform they wear. And so I think it is absolutely in line with the values of the reform movement to make sure, as Terry pointed out, that our criminal laws apply equally to employers as they do to workers. And so in those respects, I would say it's absolutely in line with our broader goals, at least here in Travis County.
Absolutely. That's very well said. And I want to bring your perspective in, DA Bragg, in terms of why you have made this issue such a priority in your office as well, and how you see it as linking to public safety issues.
Great to be here. It's a good thing about going third after two learned people is I can pretty much echo. DA Garza used the term that I use a lot in this work, which is destabilizing. This is when you don't get paid for your work, that's destabilizing, and not just to the worker harmed, but to the broader community. And so there's a direct link to public safety. I love Terry's example of sort of the embezzlement and the equity. I will be borrowing that. I've spent a lot of my career as a public corruption prosecutor and doing criminal civil rights enforcement. So, prosecuting an FBI agent, prosecuting a mayor, a deputy mayor. I view this work, as DA Garza said, as really protecting folks from abuses in the same line as those. I call these all kind of power asymmetry cases. And I view that as a core part, as one standard of justice, one set of rules, however we want to put it. For far too long, the criminal law has been used really to continue to sort of push folks to the margins. And I think it is incumbent upon us, one, because it advances public safety, and two, because it also helps restore trust in the system that we apply these laws to protect those amongst us who are vulnerable. In our office, we created a worker protection unit. We've long had really strong footprint with the construction industry. We've expanded it to other industries, retail industries. And in large part, Terry and I were colleagues at the New York State Attorney General's office, where we did a mix of civil and criminal enforcement. And the civil work is super important, but for some actors, the deterrence of the criminal law is just so important. We see that time and time again in these kind of power asymmetry cases, where that's what is needed to get the attention and to get the results. And so we're really, really proud of this work in New York, and it's a really pressing issue. In New York, wage theft accounts for nearly $1 billion in lost wages each year. And so, to your point about this being under prosecuted, it's a pressing issue, and it's one that I think is really, really a significant piece of the public safety puzzle in Manhattan.
Thank you, DA. Charlie, the DA mentioned construction, the construction industry specifically. What other professions are most likely to fall victim to wage theft, and which communities are most impacted and most harmed by these kinds of cases?
Thanks for that question, Rachel. And I'll just echo again and say it's a privilege to be in this panel and in space with all these folks doing amazing work. And especially, we've been working in collaboration with the Manhattan DA's office for the past 5-6 years since I've come into NYCOSH, really trying to tackle this question about wage theft, and particularly focus in the construction industry. The construction industry is an industry that's ripe for wage theft. The informal nature of the industry, the per diem nature of the industry is what attracts a lot of unscrupulous employers to hire particularly immigrant workers. And those are the folks that we deal with at NYCOSH on a daily basis. And to your question, besides construction, there's, we've seen construction, nail salon workers. It's super prevalent in the nail salon industry. Like, we have nail salon workers come into our office because we do trainings for them. And I would say 9 out of 10 nail salon workers will report getting paid below the minimum wage. 8 or 9 out of 10, and that's me being generous, right? So nail salon workers, restaurant workers, domestic workers, particularly anywhere where you'll find predominantly immigrant communities or undocumented communities as well. I often tell workers who come to our OSHA trainings, I do like know your rights trainings, and I start the know your rights training by asking them who's been a victim of wage theft. And you'll have like a few hands, maybe like 3-4 hands at a room out of like 30 or 40. And then I go over like what your rights are and like different forms of wage theft, right? Like as Terry outlined in the beginning, right? Wage theft doesn't just happen when an employer withholds your check, right? It's when an employer is not paying you minimum wage, not paying you overtime. Sometimes they misclassify you as a worker. And so all these different ways in which employers steal wages from their workers. 30 minutes later, I ask the same question, and you have at least half of the room say that they have been victims of wage theft. So definitely, it's particularly affecting the immigrant community and undocumented community here in New York City. And it's really all about most folks won't even know that they're victims of wage theft unless they are exposed to like what their rights are, right? A lot of folks don't even know that they have the right to speak up, that they have the right to like file a claim or to ask their employers for a minimum wage. So yeah.
Thank you. It's such an important point and such an important thing for prosecutors who are interacting with community members to talk about, so that folks who are being violated know more about their rights and know how to respond. And I want to come back to that later in our conversation about how we can better educate folks to know when they're experiencing wage theft. But Scott, I want to bring you in to kind of get things a little bit more practical. We've talked big picture, but I want to guide a lot of the prosecutors on our call today around kind of the nuts and bolts of prosecuting wage theft cases. So can you kind of give us a description of a common wage theft sort of fact pattern and how you work to build a case?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And it's a real privilege and honor to be here as well. So we've heard a little bit about some potential types of wage theft. And I do think it is really important to become familiar with these different patterns that are out there, because you're going to see it crop up in different ways. And it's not going to be kind of that straightforward, like we're taking money out of your pocket type situation. And so you do have to be like familiar with these fact patterns. So, I think one of the most straightforward ways would be not paying a worker any wages for the work performed. Often you'll see that combined with this inducement to kind of get the worker to continue working by promising payment. Sometimes you may even see additional employees be getting hired when they haven't even paid the workers who are there who have done work. We've mentioned before not paying minimum wage. So this goes back to being educated and helping educate workers on what minimum wage is. There's federal minimum wage, there's state minimum wage, and then a lot of local jurisdictions have their own minimum wage laws. So you may have a situation where, you work in one county for 1 week and then the job moves to another county. Well, you may actually be owed higher wages in that other county than the one you were just working in. So that's another common one. Paying a daily or weekly rate instead of paying overtime. So in most states, overtime laws is you get overtime meaning paid usually time and a half for working more than 40 hours in a week, or maybe 8 hours in a day. And so if you're just getting paid a kind of a flat rate or a weekly rate and working more than those 40 hours a week or 8 hours in a day, then you're owed overtime, and that would be wage theft to not pay it. Certainly managers keeping tips. So some places will have tip pooling. Sometimes you get the tip directly to you as the worker. Those could be taken by management and not distributed properly. You heard maybe earlier, Terry mentioned kickback. So the common fact pattern there is an employer may provide paychecks to workers. Everything looks like above board, but then kind of behind the scenes, the boss is going with the worker to cash the checks. And then with that cash is requiring workers to then pay the boss back, in wages that are owed to the workers. And we mentioned payroll deductions. Basically, that would be a situation where, again, maybe it looks like on your pay stub that money is being given to the unemployment insurance or to pensions, but in fact, the employer is just keeping it, and the worker doesn't find out about it until they go to take advantage of those benefits. And then I think just lastly, you often see wage theft, and these can be really good cases because a lot of it is kind of there's usually a good paper trail for this, is when government contracts with private employers. Oftentimes localities will have a prevailing wage that is usually above minimum wage. And then you'll have a lot of requirements by the employer that they have to provide to the government regarding documentation. So employee timesheets of how much they worked, and then documentation of what they paid. And so they'll document it as if they paid prevailing wage when in fact they haven't. And so that is often another situation if you have kind of a government contract involved.
Thank you, Scott. Terry, I want to ask about statutes and legal authority that prosecutors can rely upon, especially criminal authority that they can use, and what prosecutors can turn to in states where there may not be explicit wage theft legislation.
So that's a great question. And I guess I would start out just by noting that over the past 3 or 4 years, in about half a dozen states, there have been statutes passed that make wage theft a felony if it's above a certain threshold dollar amount. Laws to that effect passed specifically on that issue in California, Colorado, Minnesota, New York, Rhode Island, and I think maybe Delaware, someplace else I might be forgetting. So there are some jurisdictions where there are explicit statutes addressing wage theft and making it a felony. But even where it's not, there's a lot that prosecutors can do, and people have been creative and people have been not creative because the statute just fits, in many cases it just fits. So people have brought theft cases under theft statutes. In Minnesota, there's a theft by, before the felony wage theft, there's a theft by swindle statute, which sounds kind of old timey, but they brought some very good cases under the theft by swindle statute. There's larceny. In New York, we brought some cases charging scheme to defraud. There are, if filing a false document or maintaining false business records is a crime in your state, that's another crime. And then also often there are crimes that are interrelated. Like often there are clusters, and the employers who are violating wage theft laws and cheating workers are violating a whole host of laws. They may be cheating on taxes and not paying the unemployment insurance taxes. They may not be getting workers' comp, which is required insurance that covers when workers are injured or killed on the job. Or they may be just cheating their workers' comp and reporting they have like 4 office workers when they have 30 roofers. They may be committing other kinds of environmental violations or workplace safety and health. So there may be charges that can emerge out of those kinds of misdeeds, insurance fraud charges, for example. And a couple of other points I would say, if people are looking through their statutes trying to figure out how to bring these cases, one is that prosecutors are used to looking at the penal law or the criminal law, but sometimes these provisions might be located within the labor law or within the law that creates the unemployment insurance statute or within the workers' compensation law. And so it's definitely worth looking at other sections of law. And the other point I would make, which my own background is generally civil, not criminal. And I think that sometimes prosecutors really, really want to bring felony cases and do not really want to spend time on a misdemeanor. And I know that's for various reasons, including you have a lot more leverage when you have a felony. And so in some cases, these might be misdemeanors. And so I would just urge prosecutors to think about what a prosecution means. Instead of sort of poo-pooing a misdemeanor, I would urge prosecutors to think about what a prosecution, even for a misdemeanor, means to an employer. And so typically employers are used to being, maybe investigated by a labor department, maybe they get a lawsuit by some legal aid office. They do not think of this conduct, even if they're doing something pretty egregious, they generally don't think of it as criminal. And so if there is a criminal prosecution, even if it's for a misdemeanor, and there's a news story that says, employer arrested for wage theft, other peer employers in that same industry, in that same geographic area, what they're going to focus on is the fact that an employer was arrested for wage theft. And the fact that it's just a misdemeanor as opposed to a felony is not going to be the most salient fact of that news story for them when they read it that morning over their coffee. So I think there are a whole range of different kinds of charges that people can bring, and it's worth understanding what a charge, even a relatively low-level charge, might mean in the employment context in which this is a relatively new phenomenon of these cases being prosecuted at all.
So one of the things that all prosecutors have to do, of course, and we've talked about this at length in our previous webinars, is around prosecutorial discretion and making decisions about which cases to prioritize and how to use limited resources. So DA Bragg, I want to ask you, how does your office go through selecting which of the wage theft cases that gets referred to you that you're going to pursue?
So, the factors we look at, I think, will be unsurprising. We're looking at the number of workers that are impacted. We're looking at whether someone's a repeat offender, if someone's had a civil settlement before, and that did not stop them. To me, that suggests that, criminal remedies really are called for. And the amount of money, although I would say that nothing is dispositive. And one thing that I've been encouraging my office to do, we have a number of sort of, multi-million-dollar cases, which are obviously important, and that's important conduct to stop. But we've been doing more low dollar cases, under the theory that if it's a one worker case or two worker case, and those two workers are out, $7,000. Just gonna think of the last one we charged. Like, that's a whole lot of money. And to think about, to go back to other points of equity and other cases we're charging, if someone takes $7,000 out of someone's pocket, that's significant. And so we've been doing those cases. I do, as Terry suggested, we are mindful of sort of the industry and who's watching, and so we are picking cases to hopefully have an amplification effect, realizing that there's so much wage theft that we're not going to be able to do it all. We won't be able to detect it all, but hopefully that will get eyes on us. And the other thing that I think is really important and we prioritize is the worker safety issues. And sometimes those will be worker conditions that will go hand in hand. The person who's not paying the correct wage is often doesn't care about the worker conditions, and so we want to put those hand in hand. But also threats. I mean, we did a case. The reason $7,000 speaks is in my mind, and it's an active case. These are allegations. We charged someone who day laborer mustered up the courage to go and say, "Look, you owe me this amount of money." It was $7,000, and the employer said, "Well, I'm going to call ICE on you." And threatened to assaulted the person we allege. So that's, that's obviously have a lot in that one case. And we have a couple like that. One where, the worker was made to work and locked in the premises. And so like those kind of, those kind of cases have additional dimensions we want to really put extra eyes on. And I just wanted to sort of add an addendum to sort of how we charge these cases. We're proud in New York to be in that list that Terry mentioned, and we were part of the effort to get our law changed. And so we charge schemes of fraud, tax, other ones, things that Terry said. But now our grand larceny law will now defines property, which did not before include wages, now includes wages. And so that's a tool that we're looking to use going forward.
Thank you, DA. And DA Garza, I want to ask you as well about how your office approaches acquiring wage theft cases and identifying them.
Well, we have worked hard over the last several years to build relationships with the labor movement here in Travis County, with worker centers here in Travis County, and with our legal service providers, with folks who serve vulnerable communities that we know historically are victims of wage theft. And so the majority of our cases come from those community partners. And it's a continuous effort to make sure that we are accessible to those communities, accessible to those groups, that we're reminding folks that these are cases that we are serious about and willing to take. But that's where the bulk of our cases come from.
Great. And Charlie, I want to ask you about working. Of course, a lot of victims of wage theft go to community-based organizations like where you are, and they turn to you for guidance. What is that process like, and what type of information do you gather? And then how does it end up at a DA's office?
Yeah, so some folks will definitely come directly to organizations. And sometimes people, like I mentioned previously, sometimes people don't even know that they're victims of wage theft, right? They'll take a training from us, they'll sit down for a know your rights training. They'll understand that they've been stolen of wages, and they'll talk to someone like me, a community organizer or an advocate in the organization. They'll explain kind of the situation. How we usually do it is, we talk to the worker, we schedule like a sit down, we do like an internal intake with them, where we do ask all the questions like who the employer is, who paid you, what was the situation, and really try to screen the worker to understand like what is going on, and not only situations particular to them, but like what's going on in the workplace, like what is the situation, like who is this employer, like then we do some research, and we kind of decide from there, right, what it is that we can do. Sometimes it's a situation where we can step in and advocate for the worker themselves, right? Maybe we don't need legal recourse. Maybe I can just pick up the phone and call the employer myself, right? Which I've done several times, and and I tell the employer, like, hey, like, we're not trying to, like, take the legal route. We're just trying to, like, figure out situation. Like, sometimes that'll be enough for the employer to kind of react and be like, okay, you know what, like, just give me like a week, right, and I'll figure it out. I'll set up a payment plan or something. Sometimes the employer will just be like, screw you, and hang up, or just flat out deny, like, knowing the worker. And then that's when we will, like, find what avenues to take it to usually we work with pro bono attorneys, or Department of Labor. And in cases where there are these dimensions to the case, right, where we do see health and safety violation, where we do see perhaps discrimination, where we do see wage theft, and a number of other violations that are outstanding, we will contact the DA's office, right? We'll work with folks like Rachana from the Manhattan DA's office, for example. Give her a call or shoot her a text and be like, hey, can we get on the phone? Like, I'm looking at this case. And we've passed in the past, and recently we updated this intake form. Actually, we call it the DA reporting toolkit that we did together with the then construction task force, where we have like a list of screening questions, right? Like who the employer is, like, are there photos of the workplace? What's the situation? We have links to, like, check out, like, where you can see if the company has an active license, a DOB license, any MWBE certifications that they may be violating. So it's a good way for for me to then, like, take my screening and, like, translate it into, like, the DA's intake process, and then hand it off, right? And then if in cases where if folks from the DA's office want to come in, want to interview workers, sometimes they do it in our offices as well, right? It's a neutral place. It's a place where the worker feels comfortable. They already know who I am. They already know who the organization is, and so it establishes and establishes that sense of trust, right? And for the long term, because we know, like, these cases do take some time. So yeah, that's usually how that process works. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So Terry, I want to turn to you for prosecutors who may be new to this space and wanting to seek to begin prosecuting wage theft cases. How do they start? And where do they get their expertise from, or where should they get their expertise from? Is it better to bring in someone with outside civil experience, or is it better to bring prosecutors from within the office and train them in wage theft areas? I'm hoping you can speak a little bit to some of those pros and cons.
Great. So I think there's sort of two questions encompassed in that. One is related to how do you get started, and the other is sort of who's the best people to be staffing this. And I think that they're kind of intertwined questions, because I think the best way to get started is to dedicate a staff person to it, to have someone who's going to work every day to figure out how it is in your jurisdiction, your office is going to prosecute wage theft. If you can't do that, and you can, it has to be assigned to someone else because staffing doesn't permit it, at the very least, having somebody who is tasked with this, and it could be like an exciting professional development opportunity for someone as well. So there are people who could be really excited about it, but I think that, as with any kind of work, people have a lot on their plates, and if this is just one more thing as opposed to a real assigned, specific, dedicated area of focus, like I just think that's very important. In terms of what kind of person, there's the possibility of finding someone who has a lot of experience and knows a lot about workers' rights. But right now, there aren't that many people who have joint experience in workers' rights and expertise on workers' rights and criminal prosecution. So, you sort of have the choice in most cases between someone who really knows a lot about workers' rights or someone who knows a lot about criminal prosecution. And I've seen offices do both. And I think they both can work. I think that, sometimes people who know criminal prosecution can learn the labor piece of it relatively easily, and it may be a little bit more challenging for someone who hasn't ever been a criminal prosecutor to sort of learn the different language. But a lot of it just depends on hiring the right people and trying to get them trained up. And I think it's also important within a DA's office, if there's a DA who the elected leader at the top really supports this, and you hire someone to take this on, it's important also that all those intermediate levels of management actually are on board and invested in the project as well, and are not sort of thinking this isn't really criminal and sort of creating an impediment. But then once the person is hired, there's the question of like, how do you start doing this work? And some of it is just there's a growing amount of materials out there about this. I've collected a lot of them on a web page in where I used to work at the center at Harvard, so I'll share that link. But there's an increasing number of materials, both guides like the IIP guide. There's a report that I wrote about this subject. There are some law review articles. There's sample pleadings of other people. Read your statutes to see what possible charges there are. Meet with all the relevant non-governmental stakeholders. I think Charlie gave a really good picture of how critical it is to partner with community organizations, with worker organizations, with unions. They are on the ground. They're talking to workers who have problems. It is never going to occur to them like to think on their own, I'm going to go to the DA's office. That's not a logical, obvious place they're going to go for help. They may go to the police. And so that's another piece of this, is trying to tell the police, like, don't just send them away saying go to small claims court, but at least, call us. But working with worker organizations is really, really essential. And then finding other government partners as well. If there's a local state labor department, which some cities have, the state labor department, DA, workers' comp agency, UI agency, the federal agencies. So there's a lot of different, a lot of sort of groundwork to do and mapping in order to get the picture of like, what are the possibilities jurisdictionally and the statutes, who are the working groups and the organizations that are going to help develop your pipeline of cases, and then come up with your plan that like matches the resources that you actually have. But one final thing I would say also is that like, you don't, sometimes people feel like they have to like come up with everything, and sometimes you just build a plane while you're flying it, and you dip your toe in and you do one case, and you fit in. Maybe it's not the most enormous, groundbreaking case, although you will get a lot of coverage and a lot of deterrence even from a relatively small case, I would say. But sometimes you just do a case and you figure out your processes, as you're doing it, because sometimes I've seen people in government really be like very, very analytical, but a little bit paralyzed and not quite as action oriented as would be helpful for moving an agenda forward.
Diego, I saw you nodding a lot during while Terry was talking, particularly about community groups. And I just wanted to ask you or invite you to talk about how your office has approached wage theft since you began prosecuting these cases under your watch.
Well, let me just say that I have found myself nodding in agreement often with Terry over the last 10 years, and always grateful to hear her thoughts. Just to give you some context here, in the deep red state of Texas, our criminal statute was clarified in 2013 to make clear that our theft of service statute also covered what we've talked about during the course of this discussion and what we know as wage theft. From approximately 2013 to 2020, there were 4 criminal cases of wage theft brought across the entire state of Texas. Here in Travis County, Austin, Texas, lovingly referred to often as the blueberry in the middle of the tomato soup. Advocates and activists, people who care about working people, had been asking our prosecutors and law enforcement to take wage theft seriously for a long time. When I was fortunate enough to take office in 21, the first thing I did was hire my dear friend and colleague from the Workers' Defense Project. And just as an aside, for those of you who don't know, before I was privileged to take this office, I led a worker center here in the state of Texas, and so hired my colleague and friend to help us start up what we refer to as an economic justice enforcement initiative. It was a mouthful, but we had a small set of resources, and so I was just really connecting with Terry's urging that really this work in so many instances is just a leap of faith, that you have to step out there and just start to do it, because there are people who need us to do it, who want us to do it, and who are depending on us to do it. And so since that time, we began to meet with community groups, let them know that this was work that we were interested in taking on. We began to meet with our law enforcement partners to educate them about these crimes and why these crimes mattered. And it really took us about a full year to get our first case in the door. But since that time, our office in the last 3 years has indicted 4 wage theft cases, right? So we've matched the number of wage theft prosecutions in the entire state of Texas over a 7-year period in just the last 3 years. And we are very much, as Terry suggested, building the plane as we fly it. But as we are building it, as we are flying it, we're seeing real impacts, real improvements for working people in our community. So that has been the evolution of these cases in our office. And I'll just note, I was so glad to hear DA Bragg talk about the importance of criminal health and safety violations that we know occur far too often to vulnerable workers. And we see that as the next phase in the evolution of our project. And we know how deeply tied wage theft and health and safety risks are. Typically employers who disregard their workers do so in a number of ways. And as we said at the outset, that destabilizes that person, their family, and our community. And so that, we hope, will be the next evolution for us.
Thank you so much. Charlie, we've been talking a little bit about the importance of engaging with local nonprofits. And for prosecutors' offices that are maybe just starting out in this space, how would you advise them to build relationships with local nonprofits to help wage theft victims?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, meeting the folks where they're at, as somebody who has come from the worker center world as well, it's often great to see, enforcers come into our office, right? Get to know the staff, get to know the team, get to know the organizers, get to know the advocates, the people who are sitting down with workers, and get to know like the whole picture, right? Or what is it that the work that we're doing, right? Not just sort of come in when like the wages have been stolen, but continue this collaboration even when we have questions, just like, or doubts, or we want to like advocate for stronger enforcement, like generally, like across the city, across the state. We want folks to feel, we want enforcement to also be advocates with us, right? Advocates for all workers. And yeah, I mean, I would that's my biggest suggestion, right? It's just meeting workers and meeting advocates where they're at, and understanding that there are there are nuances on how workers on how this work gets done, right? Like if a worker may come, they may come with a case, and then once they hear that we want to involve the DA's office, perhaps they'll just ghost us, right? They won't come back, they'll hesitate, right? They'll take a couple more weeks to think about if this is really what they want to do, and so it takes these conversations, right? Like it takes time, right, to like talk to workers and to gain that trust. So yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. DA Bragg, we've talked a lot about the impact on individuals and how wage theft crimes relate to public safety issues, how does prosecuting wage theft impact a community more broadly? And what do you say to prosecutors who say, look, I have limited resources and I can't focus on these cases because I want to focus on violent crime?
So I'm going to go back to the word that DA Garza used, destabilizing. I mean, we see it in these cases. I'm thinking of an ongoing matter we have where one of the victims was evicted from his apartment because he couldn't pay rent. Direct line between that and not getting paid the wages to which he was entitled under the law. And so the disruption in people's lives directly impacts our public safety. I think it's an age-old and important question, and sort of as folks who are principal in office, sort of where to allocate resources. And certainly it's something we think about a lot. I mean, while we've been doing this work in Manhattan the last couple of years, all of our violent crime has gone down. Shootings are down 38%, homicides are down 24%, index crime is down overall. And so certainly it's something we think about. We're obviously going to adequately staff homicides and shootings, and I think it's going to be different for each office in terms of the number of resources you have. We have in Manhattan an office of more than 500 assistant district attorneys, and we have a very robust white collar investigative practice. And so for me, the question is less sort of, am I taking someone off of a homicide to do a wage step? It's within our white collar cases and our long-term cases, because you're always going to do if there's a homicide, there's a case that's live, it's always going to get priority. The cases that take time to build often can, if you're not intentional about it, I think this goes back to what Terry said about staffing, having dedicated staff. And I would say, while we give wage theft primacy, and I thank Charlie for shouting out Rachana, who was phenomenal. We also have this work touching upon other, we see in our kind of prevailing wage cases, it's, there may be a bribe paid. So maybe we pull in someone who's got an expertise in public corruption. It may be something that we want to use some other long-term tactics that our securities fraud folks use. Just cross-staffing to sort of expand to the needs. But it can be done. I mean, we all set priorities, and to go back to sort of Terry said, you think about the embezzlement case. Are you going to not do the embezzlement case if someone comes in and says, this employee took X amount from me? And it's just the opposite side of that coin. And something I think about in a lot of our work, whether it's police accountability or conviction review, like this, we only get our work done and drive public safety if people trust us. And I've seen it when I'm out in communities time and time again. Yeah, of course they want to know we're doing the homicides and the shootings and the assaults, and of course we are. But are we holding everyone accountable? Are we doing things that they know that they see? I mean, not everyone is fortunate to have a job, but those who do certainly want to get paid. And it's something that everyone understands. And says, wait a second, like I could go to work and not get paid, and as my TA, you wouldn't do anything about that. And so I think it's just something that really is so intuitive. And when people see you doing it, you say, oh, you really do. You stand up every day and say you work for the people of the state of New York. You really are working for me when you do that work. And it really helps us, I think, do our violent cases, right? Because there are witnesses who don't want to talk to us. And they find out we did a wage case or a policing case, and they say, oh, okay, all right, I'm going to talk to the ADA. So I think it goes hand in hand and really does advance not just public safety in the ways we've talked about, but really helps to restore trust, which is so important to all the work we do.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great point. Scott, with that in mind, in terms of the importance of building trust, as DA Bragg was just discussing, how do you raise awareness that wage theft is a crime and that the local prosecutor is taking it seriously? And then also, what do you do in jurisdictions where maybe there isn't a local prosecutor that has been prosecuting these cases? How would you advise workers in those jurisdictions?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to touch too and piggyback on something DA Bragg was talking about too, related to kind of harms that can happen to the community. One that we haven't touched upon is prosecuting wage theft also helps not only kind of restore also an economic marketplace that is fair for businesses that are competing lawfully. So you've got unlawful businesses out there doing these bad acts. Meanwhile, you've got businesses who are following the law. It's really hard to compete with them if other businesses are allowed to get away with that type of behavior. Additionally, when people don't get paid their wages, I think they rely more heavily on the social safety net that we have and social services. So we're seeing taxpayer dollars going to basically prop up these unlawful businesses, when really, if the worker gets paid properly by the employer, then they're not having to rely on the social services like that. I think that definitely, it's already been touched on, but as far as education goes, it's a huge thing, because if a DA office is going to focus on this, they have to let the community know that their door is open for business and is taking these cases, because it just hasn't been a traditional place that folks have gone to remedy these wrongs. And so reaching out to the CBOs and the labor organizations and government agencies is all good, but I just want to add like some more concrete examples to the next step of that, because just speaking from experience, when I opened the worker protection unit at the SFDA's office, it's not just going and having one conversation with the CBO one time. It's not just having a single conversation with the labor union. One thing we did was we started a labor advisory council where we brought together on a quarterly basis the labor unions in the Bay Area community. And it was a chance to have an open dialogue about issues that they were seeing. And additionally, at every one of those meetings, I provided some type of training so that we were also giving back to these, labor unions, stuff that would be helpful for them. Again, when you do go to these and have these conversations, one thing that I found repeatedly is like, okay, well, what kind of cases are you looking for? So you need to be prepared with a checklist and kind of a rubric, and DA Bragg touched upon, I think, some really important parts of why would a case go to the DA's office as opposed to being enforced civilly or going to one of the other labor agencies. But you've got things like repeat offender, you've got things like number of workers, and then you've got things like other areas or crimes that agency doing it civilly may not be able to do. One thing we haven't talked about in that regard is labor trafficking. There's a ton of labor trafficking cases that are also going to go hand in hand with wage theft. So if your local labor commissioner's office gets one of those cases, you need to have a line of communication open. So they say, hey, this is one of those kind of red flags that we saw over here. We're going to refer this case over to you.
Thank you, Scott. DA Garza, I want to bring up a topic that I think we touched upon very briefly earlier, which is the intersection with protecting immigrant rights. And a considerable challenge that we see so oftentimes in prosecuting wage theft cases is that companies can weaponize immigration laws to scare workers into silence. How do you protect the rights of undocumented immigrants when prosecuting wage theft cases?
Well, I think, I want to just emphasize a point again that DA Bragg made, which is that one of our real challenges in our criminal legal system, particularly post the murder of George Floyd, is to rebuild trust with vulnerable communities in our criminal legal system. And so the first step that we have to take in protecting undocumented victims is building trust with the undocumented community here in Austin and in Travis County. And we do that in a number of ways. One is by being in community with them, by getting out of the office and getting to know those communities, as Charlie said, by meeting them where they are. But the second is by trying to make clear in as many ways as we can that we see them as more than just potential victims of crime and potential victims wage theft. So it means, using our bully pulpit to take strong stances against efforts to criminalize the immigrant community, to criminalize the undocumented community. It means using our bully pulpit to stand up against efforts to demonize our immigrant community, our undocumented community. We have dramatically expanded access to U visa certification in our office to make clear that we take seriously protecting victims of crime, and particularly vulnerable victims of crime. And then again, it's about again, trying to build relationships with our law enforcement community so that they also understand the importance of protecting members of our undocumented community. So, there are a number of things that we have tried to do, but at base, it's really about building trust and trying to be clear that we are champions for our undocumented community in every space.
Thank you. And Terry, I want to have you build off of that if you could, because there's a recent policy from last year where the Department of Homeland Security implemented a policy to curb an employer's ability to weaponize immigration enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about that policy and how it can help victims of wage theft crimes?
Sure. And I've also we've shared some materials in the chat about that. One is the announcement from DHS of their deferred action policy, and the other is a one-year report by the National Immigration Law Center on the one-year anniversary of this program being in effect. So as we've sort of talked about in various ways, there are a lot of obstacles for workers to report violations and crimes committed against them, in a range of context, but including wage theft and other worker exploitation kinds of crimes. And, one of the big concerns is employers weaponizing immigration status. And so in this way, immigration law and immigration enforcement really becomes an obstacle and sort of an impediment for workers exercising their rights and for enforcement agencies enforcing the law. So DHS announced a policy a little over a year ago in which they're granting deferred action, which is a discretionary thing that they're able to grant. It comes with temporary legal status for a period of 2 years, including a work permit. And this deferred action is for workers in cases where there is a labor enforcement agency or a law enforcement agency is investigating employment or labor violations, and it can be civil or it can be criminal. And so without going into all of the details about how you actually get this status for workers, it's pretty, for our purposes, the big picture is that they have constructed a process that is really not very onerous for the enforcement agency to do this for workers who are witnesses in their cases. The agency just has to submit what's called a statement of interest and basically just explain, we're investigating this employer and, for this set of crimes or violations, and give some information about the case. The statements of interest are not like 20 or 30 page, like grand documents. They're relatively short and brief and to the point. And then workers will have to have their own immigration lawyer who will then submit the statement of interest from the state or local enforcer or agency to DHS and get this work permit, get this deferred action. And it's really, the NILC report notes that over, I think, 1,000 people have gotten this deferred action since it started. And this really enables people to come forward and report violations. And from a prosecution point of view, it allows you to make sure that you're going to actually have your witnesses available, which is the purpose of this, to avoid having immigration interfere with prosecution or civil enforcement, and make sure that you're going to be able to have the workers and witnesses you need available as witnesses in your cases. There's also, we mentioned briefly, U visas. They they too can be available in some labor-related cases, like where there's trafficking, obstruction of justice, perjury, peonage, extortion. There's like a subset of qualifying criminal activities that count for a U visa, but there is a really long backlog for getting U visas. So that is something also people should be aware of in this context, but it may not provide the same kind of immediate relief that the discretionary deferred action will.
Thanks. And I know we've been talking fairly abstractly about wage theft cases, and I know we're running a little tight on time, but I'm going to ask those of you who have prosecuted, or your offices have prosecuted wage theft cases, to give an example of a wage theft case that that your office handled. And maybe, Scott, we can start with you. I know you had a high-profile case in San Francisco District Attorney's Office involving Handy Technologies, and then we'll turn to the DAs to give a quick example of a case your office has prosecuted.
Yeah, I know we've definitely been focusing on criminal prosecution, which makes total sense. But I do, as far as statutes go, I do implore folks to look at their potential civil statutes that are available. Different states do have give some DAs authority to do some prosecution civilly. That is true in California. So we were able to bring this case against Handy. They're kind of like the Uber for home cleaning and handyman services. And for misclassification of the workers as independent contractors when they should be treating them as employees. And the difference between independent contractor and employee is huge, because employees get all the benefits that we've fought for a century to provide minimum wage, overtime, stuff like that. Independent contractors don't get any of that. So in California, there's an unfair competition law that basically makes any underlying violation something you can go after, and the DA has power to do that. And it was really in line with addressing wage theft from our priorities of decarceration, because it has very powerful penalties. You can get restitution for the workers, you can get injunctive relief to stop the ongoing harm, and then you can get civil penalties to punish this bad behavior. So ultimately, we were able to get a judgment in the case for $6 million, and then also just a permanent injunction that literally changed the way that this business operates going forward, so that they aren't misclassifying their workers in the future.
DA Bragg, can I turn to you?
Sure, I'll give two quick examples inspired by what others have said. First, like our practice, NICOSH, in groups like in the Lifeblood, because that's where we're getting our referrals from. One prevailing wage case where sort of in our construction work, $1.7 million. So it had the hallmarks of so much of the prevailing wage. Shell companies set up false certified payrolls, case made through kind of search warrant evidence, showing the real deal and handwritten diaries and calendars and schedules and fake IDs. At base, same thing as in all the other cases, just folks going to work and not getting paid, charged as a scheme to defraud, which is sort of, for those who are federal prosecution, kind of like a mail fraud, wire fraud, sort of a statute. But as Terry mentioned, that's why I kind of picked this example, had false filings because those certified payrolls are going to a government entity. Also, there was a bribe paid to a project manager to keep it going. And so these cases can have a lot moving in them. And the other one I want to just briefly mention, because we charged it last week, and Scott mentioned labor trafficking. And it just, I think for those who want to sort of divide the world into, worker protection and violence, I mean, they merge together a lot. And we did a labor trafficking case last week. We alleged a superintendent in a building, forced labor of someone to clean that building for 6 years. Living, on the top of the building on one mattress, and we allege also raping that victim as well. So, a lot of these cases are about control, coercion, power asymmetry, and they come across in various forms. But we're seeing more and more that violence, not in every wage theft. Obviously, we want to do the cases where if what's happened to you is you have your wages, that is serious in and of itself. But this sort of nice separation into, there's wage theft over here, and then there's, violence over here. They merge a lot, and they come from a place of power and control.
Thank you. Dia Garza, any examples you want to share?
Yeah, I'll share the story of our first indictment, particularly those for those prosecutors or those offices that may be listening, just as an example of what it could look like to, as Terry encouraged us to just get started. So our first case, our first indictment was of the owner of a home renovation company who had operated under multiple business names over a long period of time and had a reputation throughout communities who serve the undocumented community here. I'm sorry, through organizations that serve the undocumented community here in Austin as a bad actor. His MO was to write hot checks and then, when a worker would confront him about that, would sort of be to blame it on an error at the bank, just to sort of get them to keep working to finish the project, and then never pay them. And so our first case was against that employer. It was two workers. $4,000 is what was owed. We indicted the case, and it's also, I hope we'll get to one of your earlier questions about how we sort of square our values around criminal justice reform. And so this particular defendant entered into a pretrial diversion program with our office. And as a result of that program, is paying restitution, is making those workers whole, and is required to regularly check in with our probation officer and provide bank statements so that we can assure that he is not continuously using these practices and writing hot checks, to continue to steal from and coerce other workers. So that was our first case. It was a relatively straightforward one, but it mattered a great deal to those two workers, and it helped us to get started.
Excellent. Thank you. Scott, really quickly, I want to talk about judges before we move on to some other questions, but how can prosecutors educate the bench about prosecuting these kinds of cases if judges may not be as familiar with them?
Yeah, it is something to be prepared for prosecutors in these cases when you do go in front of the criminal judge who's just used to thinking of this as a civil issue. So number one, I think just being prepared is helpful. Maybe, we put into our warrants some pretty extensive language related to the actual laws because they may not be familiar with the labor laws. So, I wouldn't, shy away from education in the warrant itself. And then, it does really help to pick some strong cases early on where you have these situations where they're not, people are paid zero and working, and it's like every judge should know you cannot, do that. So that really helps to pick some strong cases early to educate the bench.
Thank you. Okay, Terry, this question addresses a pet peeve of mine, which is around media coverage of this issue, or lack thereof, I should say. Can you speak to why, cases like shoplifting, we see a lot of headlines around them, but we're not seeing a lot of attention on crimes like wage theft, and how can we ensure that it's getting more attention? And why do you think it's not getting enough?
I mean, I think, I share the frustration about retail theft being so heavily prioritized and being so front and center relative to wage theft, which is really much more common. And I think, we go back to some of the themes that we talked about in the beginning of the conversation about, equal justice for everyone and ensuring equal access to the law. And the victims of retail theft, obviously it's bad for frontline workers when they have to contend with this, but generally the victims of retail theft are corporations, and the victims of wage theft are ordinary working people. And so the differential amount of like media and legislative and other attention sort of speaks to other kinds of power asymmetries, money asymmetries within our society of like whose problems get paid attention to and which kinds of problems do not. And I want to be clear, I'm not in favor of retail theft, and I think it's bad. I want to be totally clear about that. But I do think that asymmetry between, that like wide divergence between the amount of attention to retail theft versus wage theft really speaks to a lot of other issues in relation to not just the criminal justice system, but also in relation to, our country as a democracy and whose concerns get heard. And how to deal with that is just, try to raise attention in the media with legislators, take it seriously. When DAs bring cases, they generally do get publicized. And that publicity, there's a study I always talk about by a Duke professor, Matt Johnson, about how issuing press releases in relation to OSHA really help deter violations by peer employers, meaning those in the same region and in the same industry. And so, to the extent that DAs are taking on this work, it really changes the narrative in terms of this being conveying very clearly that this is a really serious problem that needs to be dealt with.
Thanks so much, Terry. I want to give everyone a chance before we turn to a few questions from the audience. I want to give everyone kind of a last word, and I want to start with you, Charlie, in terms of what advice would you give to prosecutors seeking to engage in wage theft prosecutions or ones who are already doing the work? What kind of would your top advice be to them?
My advice would be, as I mentioned before, meeting workers where they're at, speaking to the advocates. They're the experts on the ground and, understanding the situation. And yeah, get boots on the ground, right? There's nothing like a good, work site visit, right? Just to, pop in, get employers, get employers to know that work is being done around this, that workers are protected. And also, lastly, I'll say the education piece is super important as well, right? Making sure workers are being educated about this, and if your office is perhaps doesn't have the reach, right, to educate all workers about what their rights are, working with those advocates, helping connect advocates to funding, whether it's municipal funding, whether it's state funding, opportunities to do like these like know your rights workshops, to do like outreach, to stand on the day, to go to the day labor corners at 6 a.m. 7 a.m. right, on a Tuesday morning, right. There's a lot of support that can be done to make sure that workers are educated and they know their rights, and they know that they have the prosecutors behind them as well.
Thank you. DA Bragg, final piece of advice.
I think the partnerships with NICOSH and groups like it, so much of our docket comes in from, here in New York City, the New York Police Department. These are not the kind of cases that are just going to come to the door. So if you're looking to build a practice, it's the community groups. We have a State Department of Labor that's active. We have a City Department of Investigation, and so those are ways to sort of amplify resources. But the cases coming in the doors, you got to get out from out of the office and partner with community groups.
DA Garza.
Well, I think I would just say, jump on in. The water is fine. Particularly for those, maybe smaller offices, or offices that don't have quite the external infrastructure that may exist in other places. Wherever you are, there is a labor movement. There are organizations that advocate on behalf of working people, and there are most certainly working people, and there is most certainly wage theft happening in your jurisdiction. I think, as we've talked about, we have a responsibility to do something about it, and people depend on us too. And so, no better time than now.
Scott.
Yeah, two quick things. One is, if you're thinking about doing this work, call Terry. She knows everything, and she also seems to know everyone. So she can get you connected to other people, prosecutors doing this work, and that is really helpful. And then two, I would say, we talked about a dedicated staff person at the office, prosecutor, but also a dedicated investigator. That's really important to pull this work off, is not just having a prosecutor, but an investigator. So if you can get an investigator assigned and kind of get that person familiar with the labor stuff, that is going to pay huge dividends.
And Terry, I'll give you the last word. And I know you have some information about resources for prosecutors who are pursuing this work as well.
Yes, so I guess I would echo Scott. You can call me. At my own background is civil, but I've been convening a group of DAs and other prosecutors who've been bringing these cases and doing this work for several years now. We have a working group that has monthly virtual meetings, and we have several dozen DAs offices that join those meetings, including people from Manhattan and from Travis County and from a number of jurisdictions in California, as well as lots of other places across the country. And in those monthly meetings, people present cases and sometimes talk about problems and concerns that they have. Obviously, there's the constraint of the Zoom format, which is like so suboptimal, even though we've been doing it for a few years now. But I think it has been a really useful resource for people, and also has helped them connect with each other offline. So people can, this is something that happens every month for 1 hour, and it's relatively informal. So if anyone's interested, they can reach out to me. And then the other thing I would say to do to get started, two other things: just read everything that's out there about this and meet with worker organizations and other people doing the work.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have time for one, maybe two questions. And I'm sorry that we ran a little bit long, but I have a question. We have a question from for the DAs, excuse me, saying, how did you initially fund units prosecuting wage theft, and how have you sold the budget of the unit to funders? If either DA wants to start.
Here it's just sort of within our general budget. Not I think we may have gotten some additional, sought some additional funding from our city council, but it's just within our omnibus budget.
For us in Travis County, we were able to first secure a grant from, and I'm going to butcher their name. I should have been prepared for this, but Public Policy. What's their name? I can't remember, but I love them.
The Public Rights Project?
Public Rights Project, thank you. That helped cover the cost of a prosecutor for a year. After that grant expired, we just shifted some of our internal resources to continue to fund that prosecutor. And then we've told our broader white collar crimes unit that they're part of the team too. And so, Stephanie on our team really takes the lead in that work. And that's the one position that we have dedicated to this. And then our white collar team pitches in as necessary and as they can. I mean, again, we're a relatively small operation.
Okay, last question is for Charlie. What are the most common effects you see on families who experience wage theft, and how can they get support locally?
One of the most common things, I mean, the reason a lot of folks come through our doors is because they need the money, right? It's being stolen of, $3,000, $5,000 in wages is the difference between being able to eat, being able to pay rent for the next several months, especially in a city like New York. And so they need like all the support possible, not only, in questions of wage theft, but also, right, where can you find like the local food pantry, like housing support. It's just this, it has to be this holistic approach to helping workers who go through a situation like this. And the folks who are doing, there's folks who do that work, right, all around the country, advocates, again, just emphasizing that, right, the advocates on the ground who can support, who point out to those resources. And that's why it's really important, right, that like, enforcement happens in parallel with the work of advocate groups, so that maybe enforcement doesn't have prosecutors don't have all the answers, right? Don't have all the resources, but you know, you can pick up the phone and call like your local community organizer, and be like, hey, can you support this person with housing issue?
We'll leave it there. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for joining us today for this really meaty conversation about such an addressed topic. So thank you all for devoting your careers to a lot of this work and your insight into this conversation. We will put the link to our wage theft guide in the chat once again, and we'll continue to share information, resources, and advocacy on this issue. This is recorded, so we'll send out that link as well when it's available. And you can also find it on our website, prosecution.org. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next month for our monthly webinar. And again, I just want to thank our esteemed panelists. We're really grateful for this insightful conversation. So thank you for being with us.